When my son blocked my number, I smiled quietly to myself. He didn't know I had already blocked something far more valuable, his inheritance. And while he was ignoring my calls, I was sitting in my attorney's office, watching 40 years of carefully built wealth get redirected to people who actually deserved it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Bianca Romano, and at 73 years old, I learned that sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones you raised with your own two hands. I had spent most of my adult life building something meaningful in the rolling hills outside Bozeman, Montana. What started as a small organic herb farm in the 1980s had grown into Romano's Mountain Gardens, a thriving business that supplied restaurants and farmers markets across 3 states. The land stretched across 200 acres of some of the most beautiful territory God ever created, with the Bridger Mountains rising like cathedral spires in the distance, and Cottonwood Creek meandering through the valley like a silver ribbon. I hadn't inherited this place. I had carved it out of nothing with blistered hands and a stubborn heart. When my husband Tony died 15 years ago, everyone expected me to sell. A widow in her late 50s running a farm operation? The bank loan officers shook their heads. The neighboring ranchers offered to buy me out at prices that would have left me comfortable but landless. Even my own son Michael suggested I might want to consider something smaller, something more manageable for a woman alone. But I wasn't. Just a woman alone. I was Bianca Romano, and Romano women don't quit when the ground gets hard. My grandmother had come from Sicily with nothing but a bag of seeds sewn into her skirt lining. My mother had kept food on the table during the Depression by growing vegetables in every spare inch of dirt she could find. And I had turned their legacy into something that fed families across Montana while providing jobs for half the county. Michael was 38 now, with a wife named Jennifer who wore designer boots to family barbecues, and 2 children who called me Nona when they remembered I existed. He worked in Denver as some kind of financial consultant, flying back to Montana maybe 3 times a year, always with suggestions about how I could run things more efficiently. He had an MBA and opinions about everything, especially about how much I was spending on organic certifications and fair wages for seasonal workers. The last time he visited was in early September, when the mountains were just starting to blush with autumn colors and the harvest was reaching its peak. Jennifer had wrinkled her nose at the smell of compost and complained about the gravel road scratching her car's paint. Michael had walked through the greenhouses with his phone pressed to his ear, conducting business calls while I tried to show him the new hydroponic system I'd invested in. When I asked him to put the phone away for just 10 minutes so we could talk, he held up one finger like I was a waitress interrupting his important conversation. That gesture, that single raised finger dismissing me like hired help on my own land, should have been warning enough. But mothers have a way of making excuses for their children long past the expiration date of patience. I told myself he was stressed about work, that the drive from Denver was long, that maybe next time would be different. It wasn't until October that I realized how different things had become. I had been trying to reach Michael for 3 days straight. Nothing urgent, just wanting to share some good news about a contract we'd secured with a new restaurant chain. The farm was having its best year ever, and I wanted my son to know that his inheritance was growing more valuable every season. But my calls went straight to voicemail. My text messages showed as delivered but never read. On the 4th day, I decided to call from my neighbor's phone, thinking maybe there was something wrong with my cell service up in the mountains. Margaret Patterson had been my closest friend for 20 years, ever since she and her husband moved to the ranch next door. When I called Michael's number from her kitchen phone, he answered on the 2nd ring with a cheerful hello. My heart dropped into my stomach like a stone into a well. He had blocked my number. My own son had deliberately cut off my ability to reach him, and he was perfectly fine taking calls from everyone else in the world. I hung up without saying anything, my hands trembling as I set Margaret's phone back in its cradle. "Margaret, poured me a cup of coffee without asking if I wanted one. She had that way about her, always knowing when silence was better than questions. We sat at her kitchen table while I tried to process what had just happened. Finally, she asked quietly if everything was all right. I told her what Michael had done, and I watched her kind eyes flash with anger that I couldn't quite feel yet. I was still too stunned, too confused about how things had gotten to this point. She asked if I had any idea why he might have blocked me. I thought back over our recent conversations, searching for some offense I might have committed unknowingly. Had I called too often? Had I been too insistent about family visits? Had I somehow crossed a line that warranted being cut off completely? Then I remembered our last phone conversation 3 weeks earlier. Michael had called me, actually, to discuss what he called my financial planning. He wanted to know about my will, about the farm's valuation, about whether I had considered setting up trusts for his children. He spoke about my estate like I was already dead, using phrases like, "when you're gone," and "after you pass," that made my skin crawl. When I had gently suggested that I wasn't planning on going anywhere anytime soon, that I was in excellent health and intended to keep working the land for many years to come, his tone had shifted. He reminded me that farming was dangerous work for someone my age. What if I fell off a tractor? What if I had a heart attack out in the fields where no one could find me? Wouldn't it be more responsible to start transitioning the property now, while I could still oversee the process? I had ended that conversation feeling like Michael was waiting for me to die so he could cash in. But even that hadn't prepared me for being blocked like some kind of telemarketer or bill collector. I was his mother, the woman who had sat beside his bed through every childhood fever, who had driven him to every baseball practice and piano lesson, who had paid for his college education without him having to take a single student loan. Margaret's voice brought me back to the present. She was asking if I wanted to stay for dinner, but I thanked her and said I needed to get home. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I had some thinking to do, and I did my best thinking while walking the property lines at sunset, when the mountains caught fire with alpenglow and the valley settled into that peaceful quiet that only comes in places where the land still remembers what it was like before humans arrived. That evening, I walked farther than usual, all the way out to the ridge that overlooked the entire farm. From up there, I could see the neat rows of greenhouses catching the last light, the barn where we processed and packaged herbs, the farmhouse, where Tony and I had raised Michael and dreamed about grandchildren who would someday help with harvest season. Everything I had built, everything I had sacrificed for, everything I had planned to leave to my son who apparently couldn't be bothered to answer my phone calls. Standing there in the gathering darkness, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but a kind of cold clarity that I hadn't experienced since the day Tony died, and I realized I would have to choose between selling everything we'd built or learning to run it alone. I had chosen to fight then, and I would choose to fight now. But this time, I wouldn't be fighting to build something. I would be fighting to protect it from someone who saw it only as a commodity to be liquidated when convenient. Michael had made his position clear by blocking my number. He didn't want a relationship with me. He wanted an inheritance from me. Well, if that's how he wanted to play this game, I could certainly accommodate him. I walked back down the ridge, with purpose in my step. The farmhouse was dark except for the porch light I always left on, a beacon that had welcomed Michael home countless times over the years. Tonight, it felt more like a lighthouse warning ships away from dangerous rocks. Inside, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea from herbs I had grown and dried myself. Then I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and began making a list. Not of grievances or hurt feelings, but of people who had shown up for me, who had earned their place in my life through actions rather than accident of birth. Margaret's name went at the top. She had been there through Tony's illness and death, bringing casseroles when I was too grief-stricken to cook, and helping with chores when the physical demands of running the farm alone felt overwhelming. Below her name, I wrote Carlos Mendoza, my farm manager, who had started as a seasonal worker 20 years ago and now knew more about sustainable farming than most agricultural college professors. His daughter Sophia was studying environmental science at Montana State University on AUS, a scholarship I had quietly funded. I wrote down the names of longtime employees who had become family, of neighbors who had helped during emergencies, of young farmers I had mentored over the years. People who understood that the land wasn't just an asset, but a living thing that required respect and care. People who would preserve what Tony and I had built rather than sell it to the highest bidder. By the time I finished my list, the tea had grown cold and the clock showed nearly midnight. But I felt more clear-headed than I had in months. Michael had made his choice when he blocked my number. Now I would make mine. The next morning, I called my attorney's office and scheduled an appointment to revise my will. Janet Morrison had been handling my legal affairs for 15 years, ever since she had helped me navigate the complexities of inheriting the farm after Tony's death. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who had built her practice by understanding that farmers and ranchers needed lawyers who respected the land as much as they respected the law. When I told her I wanted to make significant changes to my estate planning, she didn't ask unnecessary questions. She simply scheduled me for the following Thursday and asked me to bring all my current documents. Professional discretion was one of the many reasons I trusted her to handle matters that would change my family forever. The drive into Bozeman that Thursday morning was spectacular, even by Montana standards. Fresh snow had dusted the peaks overnight, and the aspens were painting golden brushstrokes across the mountainsides. It was the kind of morning that reminded me why I had never wanted to live anywhere else. Why the thought of Michael selling this place to developers made my stomach turn. Janet's office was in a restored Victorian house downtown, with tall windows that looked out on Main Street and the mountains beyond. We sat in her conference room with my files spread across the mahogany table like pieces of a puzzle that needed to be completely rearranged. She explained the process carefully without judgment. Changing a will was perfectly legal, and as long as I was of sound mind and not under duress, I could leave my estate to anyone I chose. When she asked about my reasoning, I told her about the blocked phone number, about Michael's obvious impatience for his inheritance, about my growing certainty that he would destroy everything Tony and I had spent decades building. Janet took notes in her careful handwriting, asking clarifying questions about the people I wanted to include in the new will. We discussed setting up a foundation to preserve the farm as a working operation in perpetuity, with provisions for education and research in sustainable agriculture. We talked about scholarships for farm workers' children and land conservation easements that would prevent development. By the time we finished, it was nearly noon, and I felt like I had just laid the cornerstone for a building that would outlast everyone in the room. Michael would still receive something, Janet assured me. Enough to make clear that this wasn't about hatred or revenge, but about stewardship and responsibility. The bulk of the estate, however, would go to people and organizations that understood what Romano's mountain gardens represented. The new will would take 2 weeks to finalize. 2 weeks during which Michael continued to ignore my existence, unaware that his financial future was being quietly redistributed to people who had actually earned it. I went about my daily routines on the farm with a lightness I hadn't felt in years, as if I had finally set down a heavy burden I hadn't realized I was carrying. The autumn work continued around me with its familiar rhythms. Carlos supervised the final harvest of basil and oregano, while I worked on the winter preparations, cleaning and organizing the greenhouses that would keep us growing through the snow season. The farm felt more alive than ever, humming with purpose and possibility that extended far beyond quarterly profit margins and inheritance taxes. 3 weeks after my visit to Janet's office, Michael finally called. But he didn't call me directly. He called the farm's business line, probably assuming I would answer. When Carlos picked up instead and told him I was out in the fields, Michael asked to have me call him back. Carlos dutifully wrote down the message and handed it to me with raised eyebrows that said everything without words. I looked at that slip of paper for a long time before crumpling it up and throwing it in the compost bin. If Michael wanted to talk to me, he could unblock my number and call me like a civilized human being. I wasn't going to play games with someone who treated me like a business contact instead of his mother. 2 days later, he tried again, this time calling Margaret's number and asking her to have me call him. Margaret, bless her heart, told him that if he had something to say to me, he should say it directly. She didn't mention that she knew about the blocked number, but her tone apparently conveyed enough disapproval that Michael actually apologized for bothering her. It was Jennifer who finally broke the stalemate. She showed up at my door on a crisp November afternoon, driving a rental car and wearing a winter coat that probably cost more than most people made in a month. I invited her in because I was raised to be polite, but I brewed coffee instead of tea because hospitality has its limits. She sat in my living room and complimented the view, while clearly working up the courage to say whatever she had come to say. Finally, she asked if Michael had done something to upset me. She said he seemed worried that I wasn't returning his calls, that maybe there had been some kind of misunderstanding. I set my coffee cup down carefully and looked at her directly. I told her that there had indeed been a misunderstanding. Michael seemed to think that blocking my phone number wouldn't have consequences. I had simply helped him realize that actions create reactions, and sometimes those reactions are permanent. Jennifer's face went through several interesting expressions as she processed what I had said. She asked if I was sure that Michael had actually blocked my number, suggesting that maybe there was a technical problem or some other explanation. When I described my experiment with Margaret's phone, Jennifer's shoulders sagged like a balloon losing air. She tried to explain that Michael had been under a lot of stress at work, that he sometimes made decisions when he was overwhelmed that he later regretted. She suggested that pride was keeping him from admitting his mistake, that maybe I could be the bigger person and reach out first. I listened to her entire speech without interrupting, then told her something that I hoped she would remember long after she drove back to Denver. I explained that being the bigger person had gotten me blocked by my own son, that being understanding and forgiving and endlessly patient had taught him that his mother's feelings didn't matter. That sometimes love means setting boundaries, even when those boundaries feel harsh to people who have never respected softer ones. Jennifer left without finishing her coffee, and I watched her rental car disappear down the gravel road with a sense of finality that felt more like relief than sadness. The conversation had confirmed what I already knew. Michael wasn't sorry for what he had done. He was just sorry it hadn't worked out the way he planned. As winter settled over the valley and the farm shifted into its quieter season, I found myself sleeping better than I had in years. The new will was safely filed away in Janet's office, and I had started making plans for the foundation that would eventually oversee the property. Margaret and I spent long evenings by her fireplace, planning educational programs and research initiatives that would turn Romano's mountain gardens into something bigger than either of us had originally imagined. The blocked phone number had been intended as a punishment, a way for Michael to control our relationship by withdrawing his attention. Instead, it had freed me to remember who I was before I became someone's mother, before I started measuring my worth by whether my child called often enough or visited long enough or appreciated deeply enough. I was Bianca Romano, and I had built something beautiful on this land, something that would continue growing long after I was gone, nurtured by people who understood that some things are more valuable than money, and some legacies are more important than inheritance checks. Christmas arrived that year like an unwelcome house guest, bringing expectations I no longer felt obligated to meet. For 40 years, I had hosted Christmas dinner at the farm, transforming my dining room into a celebration that could accommodate extended family, neighbors, and anyone else who might otherwise spend the holiday alone. The farmhouse would fill with the smell of roasting turkey and homemade bread, with laughter echoing off the log walls and children running between the adults with sticky fingers and bright eyes. This year felt different before it even began. Michael had sent a text message to the farm's business phone in early December, asking about Christmas plans, not calling to discuss them, not suggesting we work together to coordinate, just asking. Like I was event planning staff rather than his mother. The text was forwarded to me by Sophia, Carlos's daughter, who helped with the farm's administrative work during her winter break from college. She handed me the printout with the same expression she might wear while disposing of something unpleasant she'd found in the barn. I read the message 3 times, looking for some hint of warmth or genuine interest in spending time together. Instead, I found the kind of language people use when they're checking items off a list. What time should we arrive? Should Jennifer bring anything? Will there be other people there besides family? Each question felt like a negotiation rather than anticipation. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket, where it stayed for 2 days while I considered my response. Finally, I called the farm phone from my cell phone and left a message for Michael, knowing he wouldn't recognize the number. I told him that I would be spending Christmas quietly this year, that he and his family were welcome to make their own plans, and that I hoped they had a wonderful holiday. The return call came within an hour, but not to my personal number. Michael called the farm line again and spoke to Carlos, asking him to tell me that there seemed to be some confusion about Christmas, that his family had already made travel arrangements, that they had been counting on the traditional celebration at the farm. Carlos listened patiently, then told Michael that if he wanted to discuss Christmas plans with his mother, he should probably call his mother directly. That evening, Margaret and I sat in my kitchen planning a different kind of Christmas. Instead of the elaborate family dinner that had become more obligation than joy, we would prepare a feast for the farm workers and their families. Carlos and his wife Maria had 3 children besides Sophia, and there were 4 other full-time employees, with families who had nowhere else to go for the holiday. We would cook together, eat together, and celebrate the people who had chosen to be part of my life, rather than those who treated my home like a restaurant that happened to be run by a relative. The menu planning alone felt liberating. Instead of Jennifer's dietary restrictions and her children's complicated preferences, we could focus on foods that brought comfort and joy. Maria suggested her grandmother's tamales recipe, and Sophia offered to make tres leches cake. Carlos wanted to contribute his famous smoked brisket, slow-cooked over applewood from trees on the property. I would handle the traditional elements: roasted turkey with herbs from our greenhouse, mashed potatoes with farm-fresh butter, green bean casserole made with vegetables we had grown and preserved ourselves. As we planned, I realized how much energy I had been spending over the years trying to accommodate people who never seemed particularly grateful for the effort. Jennifer always arrived with a list of things she couldn't eat, couldn't drink, couldn't be around due to various sensitivities that seemed to multiply with each visit. Michael spent most family gatherings on his phone, stepping out to take calls that were allegedly urgent, but somehow always occurred during gift exchanges or family photos. The week before Christmas, Michael tried a different approach. Instead of calling the farm, he sent an email to the business address, copying Jennifer and both of his children. The message was longer than his usual communications, filled with language about family traditions and making memories, and how important it was for the children to experience Christmas at their grandmother's farm. Reading that email felt like watching someone perform a role they had never quite learned properly. The words were technically correct, but there was no authentic emotion behind them. He wrote about family traditions as if they were items to be preserved in a museum rather than living expressions of love and connection. He mentioned the children's excitement about seeing their grandmother, but I couldn't remember the last time either child had seemed particularly excited to be at the farm. They usually spent their visits complaining about the lack of Wi-Fi, the smell of animals, and the absence of the entertainment options they were accustomed to in Denver. I printed the email and read it again more carefully, looking for any acknowledgement that he had blocked my phone number. any explanation for why he was communicating through business channels instead of simply calling me directly. There was nothing. He had written 6 paragraphs about Christmas tradition without once addressing the fact that he had deliberately cut off his mother's ability to reach him. That omission told me everything I needed to know about Michael's priorities. He wanted the benefit of our relationship without the responsibility of maintaining it. He wanted access to my home, my hospitality, and eventually my inheritance. But he didn't want to be bothered with my actual presence in his life unless it was convenient for him. I wrote my response carefully, reviewing it 3 times before sending. I thanked him for his email and explained that I had already made Christmas plans that didn't include hosting a large dinner. I mentioned that I would be celebrating with the farm family this year, focusing on the people who had supported me throughout a challenging time. I closed by suggesting that he and Jennifer might enjoy starting their own Christmas traditions with their children, creating new memories in their own home. The reply came back within an hour, and this time the careful politeness was gone. Michael's second email was shorter and sharper, asking what I meant by a challenging time and demanding to know what farm family I was referring to. He pointed out that he and Jennifer had already made travel arrangements, that disappointing the children would be cruel, and that canceling Christmas dinner seemed like an extreme response to whatever minor issue was bothering me. Minor issue. That phrase sat in my mind like a splinter, small but increasingly painful. Blocking your mother's phone number was a minor issue. Communicating only through business channels was a minor issue. Treating my home like a hotel and my hospitality like a service was a minor issue. I walked out to the barn where Carlos was checking on the goats we kept for milk and cheese production. The animals were settling in for the night, their soft bleating creating a peaceful soundtrack to the early winter evening. Carlos looked up from filling water troughs and asked if everything was all right. My face must have been showing more than I realized. I handed him the printed email and watched his expression change as he read. Carlos had worked for me long enough to understand family dynamics, and he had witnessed enough of Michael's visits to form his own opinions about my son's character. When he finished reading, he folded the paper carefully and handed it back without comment. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, checking feed levels and making sure the barn was secure for the night. Finally, Carlos spoke quietly, saying that families are like gardens. Some plants grow strong and healthy when you nurture them, but others drain nutrients from the soil and need to be removed before they kill everything around them. His words followed me back to the house, where I found another email waiting. This one was from Jennifer, written in the tone she used when she was trying to manage a situation that had gotten out of hand. She suggested that maybe everyone had gotten their wires crossed, that communication mishaps happen in every family, and that the important thing was coming together for the holidays. She offered to help with cooking and decorating, promising that she and Michael would be more present and engaged this year. The offer might have been touching if it hadn't come attached to an assumption that I would, of course, change my plans to accommodate their expectations. Jennifer wrote as if my decision to celebrate Christmas differently was a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with the right combination of promises and persuasion. I closed my laptop without responding and walked through the farmhouse, looking at the rooms where so many Christmas celebrations had taken place. The dining room where Michael had once helped me set the table, carefully arranging napkins and counting silverware with the serious concentration of a 6-year-old determined to get everything perfect. The living room where he had torn through wrapping paper with gleeful abandon, where he had fallen asleep against my shoulder while holiday movies played on the television. Those memories felt like they belonged to different people, versions of Michael and myself that had existed before disappointment and distance created the space we now inhabited. I could remember the boy who had helped me bake cookies for Santa and left carrots for the reindeer. But I struggled to connect that child to the man who found my phone calls so burdensome that he had blocked my number entirely. The next morning brought a phone call to the farm line that Carlos answered in the barn office. I was in the greenhouse checking on the winter herbs when he found me. his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant he was delivering unwelcome news. Michael had called to speak with me, he reported, and when told I wasn't available, had demanded to know where I was and when I would be back. Carlos had explained that I was working and might not be available for the rest of the day. Michael had then asked whether Carlos thought this whole situation was reasonable, whether he understood that Christmas dinner was important to families, whether he had any influence with me that might help resolve what Michael called this ridiculous misunderstanding. The conversation had ended when Carlos suggested that family communication problems might be better solved by family members talking directly to each other rather than involving farm employees. Michael had hung up without saying goodbye. Standing among the rosemary and thyme plants that would continue growing through the winter, I felt a clarity that had been building for weeks finally crystallize into certainty. Michael wasn't trying to repair our relationship or address the problems that had led to his blocking my number. He was trying to control the situation, to find leverage that would force me back into the role I had always played. The accommodating mother who prioritized his comfort over her own dignity. That afternoon, I called Janet Morrison and asked if she could recommend a good locksmith. When she asked why, I explained that I wanted to change the locks on my house before Christmas. I had given Michael a key years ago, back when his visits were motivated by affection rather than expectation, but circumstances had changed. Janet didn't ask unnecessary questions, but she did mention that changing locks was often a wise precaution when family relationships became complicated. She gave me the name of a reliable company that could handle the work quickly and discreetly. The locksmith arrived the next day, a quiet man in his 50s who replaced every lock on the property with efficient professionalism. As he worked, I walked through each room of the house, mentally cataloging which items belonged to Michael from childhood visits or family occasions. A few books, some old photographs, a wooden box that had belonged to his father. I packed these things carefully in a single cardboard box, along with a note explaining that I wanted him to have these personal items regardless of our current difficulties. The box would be my Christmas gift to Michael, delivered by leaving it on Margaret's porch with instructions for pickup. A final gesture of motherhood without requiring any response or acknowledgement from him. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear, with snow falling in fat, lazy flakes that turned the farm into a picture postcard. The farmhouse filled gradually throughout the afternoon as our chosen family gathered to celebrate. Carlos and Maria arrived, first with their children, followed by the other workers and their families. Margaret brought her famous apple pie and a bottle of wine she had been saving for a special occasion. The kitchen became a symphony of collaboration, with multiple cooks working together without tension or competition. Children ran through the house with the freedom that comes from being truly welcome, their laughter mixing with adult conversation and the sounds of a meal being prepared with joy rather than obligation. As we sat down to dinner, I looked around, the table at faces that reflected genuine happiness to be together. No one checked their phone during grace. No one complained about the food or made demands for special accommodations. The conversation flowed naturally from work stories to childhood memories to plans for the new year. Sophia raised her glass to toast the farm and everyone who worked, to keep it thriving. Carlos spoke about the importance of family that chooses you, rather than family that happens to you. Margaret thanked me for teaching her that tradition can be created as well as inherited. The toasts continued around the table, each person sharing gratitude for something specific and meaningful. When it was my turn, I looked at these people, who had shown up for me not out of obligation, but out of genuine care, and I felt a peace that had been missing from Christmas dinners for longer than I cared to remember. I raised my glass to new beginnings and the courage to choose love over habit. The wine tasted sweeter than any I could remember, and the laughter that followed my words felt like the best Christmas gift I had ever received. Later that evening, after the dishes were cleaned and the guests had gone home, I sat alone in my living room with the fire crackling and snow still falling outside the windows. The house felt full rather than empty, blessed rather than abandoned. My phone, the personal number that Michael had blocked, sat silent on the side table. But for the first time in months, that silence felt like peace rather than rejection. I had learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, and tonight, I was neither. The next morning, Christmas Day, brought 3 missed calls to the farm's business line. Carlos checked the messages while I was feeding the goats, and he delivered the news with the same expression he wore when reporting equipment problems or weather delays. Michael had called at 7 in the morning, again at 8:30, and finally at 10 o'clock. Each message was shorter and more agitated than the last. The first message asked where I was and why I wasn't answering. The second demanded that I call him back immediately to discuss what he called this Christmas situation. The third was just 10 seconds of silence followed by a sharp click. I deleted the messages without listening to them myself. Michael's inability to reach me on Christmas morning was not an emergency requiring my immediate attention. It was simply the natural consequence of his decision to block my personal number and then expect me to remain available to him through alternative channels. By noon, Jennifer had taken over the calling campaign. Her messages were longer and more elaborately reasoned, explaining that they were worried about me, that spending Christmas alone wasn't healthy for someone my age, that the children were disappointed about missing their traditional Christmas at the farm. She suggested that whatever disagreement had caused this situation could be worked out after the holidays. That family was too important to sacrifice over a misunderstanding. Each message revealed how completely they had misunderstood what was happening. This wasn't about a disagreement or a misunderstanding. This was about respect and reciprocity, about the difference between wanting to spend time with someone and feeling entitled to their availability. Michael had blocked my number because he wanted to control when and how we communicated. Now he was discovering that control can be a double-edged sword. Margaret stopped by in the afternoon with leftover pie and curiosity about whether I had heard from Michael. When I told her about the morning's phone calls, she shook her head with the disgust of someone who had raised children of her own and knew better behavior when she saw it. She asked if I was having second thoughts about changing the locks or spending Christmas differently. I considered the question seriously, examining my feelings for any trace of regret or uncertainty. What I found instead was relief so profound, it surprised me. For the first time in years, I had spent Christmas focused entirely on people who genuinely wanted to be with me rather than people who felt obligated to show up. That evening, I received a text message forwarded from the farm's business phone. It was from Michael, and the tone had shifted from demanding to pleading. He wrote that he was sorry for any confusion, that he missed our Christmas tradition, that he wanted to work things out between us. He asked if they could drive up to the farm the next day to talk in person. I read the message twice, looking for any acknowledgement of the specific actions that had led to this situation. There was none. Michael was sorry for confusion, not for blocking my number. He wanted to work things out, not to take responsibility for why things had fallen apart. He missed our tradition, not our relationship. The message felt like a negotiation tactic rather than a genuine apology. Another attempt to manage the situation without addressing its root causes. Michael wanted things to go back to the way they were before, but he didn't want to change the behaviors that had made the old way untenable. I walked out to the ridge where I had stood months earlier when I first realized that something fundamental had to change in my relationship with my son. The mountains looked different under their winter coat, more austere but also more honest. Snow had a way of revealing the true shape of things, stripping away the decorative elements to show what remained when conditions became harsh. Standing there in the cold, I understood that this was my winter season with Michael. The warmth and abundance of our early relationship had passed, and now we were in a time that would test whether anything substantial remained beneath the surface. The next morning brought the sound of a car coming up the gravel road. I watched from my kitchen window as a silver rental vehicle approached the house, moving slowly as if the driver was uncertain about the reception they would receive. Michael got out first, followed by Jennifer and their 2 children. They stood beside the car for a moment, looking at the house where new locks now protected boundaries that had been invisible for too long. Michael tried the front door handle, discovered it wouldn't turn, and knocked with the careful politeness of someone who was no longer sure of their welcome. I answered the door but didn't step aside to let them in. Michael began talking immediately, apologizing for the timing of their visit, but explaining that they needed to clear up whatever had gone wrong. He said they had driven through the night after Christmas dinner at Jennifer's parents' house in Denver, that they couldn't let things stay unresolved between us. Jennifer added that the children had been asking about their grandmother all morning, that they couldn't understand why Christmas had been different this year. The children themselves stood quietly behind their parents, looking more confused than disappointed, as if they were witnessing adult drama they didn't quite comprehend. I looked at my son and his family standing on my porch in the cold morning air, and I felt something that might have been sadness if it hadn't been so clearly mixed with relief. They had driven through the night not because they missed me, but because the situation had become inconvenient for them. They were here to restore the status quo, not to rebuild our relationship. Michael asked if we could come inside and talk, and I realized that this was the moment I had been preparing for without knowing it. The moment when I would have to choose between maintaining boundaries that protected my dignity or returning to patterns that had slowly diminished me. I told them that I wasn't ready for visitors today, that some conversations required more preparation than a surprise visit could accommodate. Michael's face showed the shock of someone who had never been turned away from my door before. Jennifer began to speak, but I continued before she could gain momentum. I explained that blocking my phone number had been Michael's way of setting boundaries around our communication. I was simply doing the same thing, setting boundaries around my availability and my home. If he wanted to have a real conversation about our relationship, he could start by unblocking my number and calling me directly like the adult he claimed to be. The children looked back and forth between their parents and their grandmother, sensing tension they couldn't name. I bent down to their level and told them that I loved them very much, that grown-ups sometimes needed time to work through difficult problems, and that I hoped to see them again soon under better circumstances. As they drove away, I felt the kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from emotional clarity. Setting boundaries was harder than accepting mistreatment, but it was also more honest. I had spent months wondering what I had done to deserve being blocked by my own son. Now I understood that the question itself was wrong. This wasn't about what I deserved. It was about what I would accept. That afternoon, my phone rang. Not the farm line, but my personal number that had been silent for so long I had almost forgotten what my ringtone sounded like. The caller ID showed Michael's name, and I felt a flutter of something that might have been hope or might have been anxiety. I answered on the 4th ring with a simple hello. Michael's voice sounded different somehow, smaller than I remembered. He said that he had unblocked my number, that he wanted to talk about what had happened between us. I waited for him to continue, but the silence stretched until he asked if I was still there. I confirmed that I was listening, and then I waited some more. If Michael wanted to talk, he would have to find the words himself. I was done carrying both sides of conversations that mattered to me more than they mattered to him. Finally, he began to speak. Michael's words came slowly at first, like water trying to flow through a partially frozen pipe. He said he knew he had made mistakes, that blocking my number had been wrong, that he had been overwhelmed with work and family responsibilities, and had made a decision he regretted. His voice carried the careful tone of someone who had rehearsed an apology without fully understanding what they were apologizing for. I listened without responding, letting his words fill the space between us while I examined them for substance. He talked about stress at his job, about pressure from Jennifer to limit family obligations, about feeling pulled in too many directions and needing to simplify his life. Everything he said positioned the blocking of my number as a symptom of external pressures rather than a deliberate choice to exclude his mother from his life. When he finished his explanation, he asked if I understood where he was coming from. The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had burned out, leaving only the bitter smell of what had been destroyed. I understood perfectly. Michael wanted forgiveness without accountability, reconciliation without change. I told him that I did understand, better than he might realize. I understood that when life became complicated, I had become expendable to him. I understood that my feelings had never entered his calculations about how to manage his stress. I understood that he viewed our relationship as optional rather than essential. His response came quickly, defensively. He said that wasn't fair. That family was important to him, that he had never intended to hurt me. But intentions, I reminded him, were less significant than actions. He had acted as if I didn't matter, and now he was acting as if the consequences of that choice were unfair to him. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, circling around the same themes without ever landing on solid ground. Michael wanted to explain his behavior without taking responsibility for it. He wanted my forgiveness without offering any concrete changes to prevent similar situations in the future. He spoke about moving forward as if we could simply skip over the work of rebuilding trust. When he asked what he could do to fix things between us, I felt the weight of a question that had no simple answer. The damage wasn't something that could be repaired with a single gesture or a series of promises. It was foundational, structural, requiring a complete rebuilding of how we related to each other. I told him that fixing things would require him to understand why they had broken in the first place. It would require acknowledging that his comfort and convenience couldn't continue to take priority over my dignity and worth. It would require him to see me as a person rather than a resource, as someone with feelings rather than someone whose job was to manage his feelings. The silence that followed was longer and heavier than any we had shared before. Finally, Michael asked if I was saying that our relationship was over, if I never wanted to see him or his family again. The question revealed how completely he had misunderstood what I was asking for. I explained that I wasn't ending our relationship, but I was changing the terms of it. I would no longer accept being treated as an inconvenience to be managed or an obligation to be minimized. I would no longer pretend that dismissive behavior was acceptable simply because it came from family. I would no longer prioritize his comfort over my own self-respect. Michael's voice grew tighter as he processed what I was saying. He asked what that meant practically, what changes I was expecting from him. I could hear the frustration building, as he realized that this conversation wasn't going to end with everything returning to the way it had been before. I told him that practical changes would have to emerge from genuine understanding, not from a checklist of behaviors designed to placate me. If he wanted to rebuild our relationship, he would need to start by examining why he had felt comfortable blocking my number in the first place. He would need to consider what messages his actions had sent about how much he valued my presence in his life. The conversation ended without resolution, with Michael saying he needed time to think about what I had said. He promised to call again soon, but the promise felt hollow, like something said to end an uncomfortable conversation rather than to begin meaningful change. 3 days passed before he called back, and when he did, his tone had shifted from apologetic to argumentative. He had apparently spent the intervening time building a case for why my expectations were unreasonable rather than examining his own behavior. He accused me of being dramatic, of turning a simple communication issue into a major crisis, of using guilt and manipulation to control his family's holiday plans. Each accusation revealed more about Michael's character than he seemed to realize. In his mind, I was the problem because I had refused to accept his mistreatment quietly. I was being manipulative because I had set boundaries around my availability. I was creating drama because I had chosen to spend Christmas with people who actually wanted to be with me. I listened to his litany of complaints with the detached interest of someone observing a specimen under a microscope. This was who my son had become. A man who viewed his mother's request for basic respect as an unreasonable demand. Someone who could block his mother's phone number and then feel victimized when she responded by protecting herself. When he finished his speech, I asked him a simple question. What did he want from me? Not what he thought I should want from him, not what he believed would be fair or reasonable, but what he actually wanted our relationship to look like going forward. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He stammered for a moment before saying that he wanted things to go back to normal, for us to put this whole situation behind us and move on. He wanted me to understand that he was doing his best, that life was complicated, that families needed to support each other through difficult times. I asked him to define what normal meant to him, what supporting each other looked like from his perspective. As he answered, a picture emerged of a relationship that was entirely one-sided. Normal meant I would continue hosting holiday gatherings without complaint. Supporting each other meant I would remain available whenever he needed, something while accepting that my needs were secondary to his convenience. He spoke about family obligations and loyalty, but only in terms of what I owed him, never what he might owe me. He talked about understanding and forgiveness, but expected both to flow in only one direction. He wanted the benefits of having a devoted mother without any of the responsibilities of being a loving son. When I pointed out this imbalance, Michael's frustration exploded into anger. He accused me of keeping score, of being petty and vindictive, of trying to punish him for making one mistake. His voice rose as he listed all the things he had done for me over the years, visiting when he could despite his busy schedule, including me and family events, allowing his children to spend time with their grandmother. Each item on his list was presented as a gift rather than the basic components of a family relationship. He spoke about visiting as if it were charity, about including me as if it were generosity, about allowing his children to know their grandmother as if it were a privilege. He could revoke. The language he used revealed how he truly saw me, not as his mother, but as a dependent whose access to his family was contingent on my good behavior. I told him that if he viewed our relationship as a series of favors he was doing for me, then perhaps it was time to relieve him of that burden. If spending time with me felt like an obligation rather than a joy, if including me in family events was a concession rather than a celebration, then maybe we both needed to reconsider what we were trying to preserve. The suggestion that I might voluntarily step back from his life seemed to shock Michael into momentary silence. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from anger to something that might have been panic. He said he didn't want me to step back, that family was important, that we needed to find a way to work through our differences. But his concern wasn't about losing our relationship. It was about losing control of it. He was realizing that his strategy of wearing me down with arguments and accusations wasn't working, that I wasn't going to return to my previous role as the accommodating mother who absorbed his frustrations without complaint. I told him that working through our differences would require him to acknowledge that differences existed, that this wasn't simply a matter of my being oversensitive or unreasonable. It would require him to examine his own behavior and consider how his actions affected other people, particularly the people who loved him. Michael's response revealed the depth of his resistance to any real change. He said he had already apologized, that he couldn't change the past, that dwelling on what had happened wasn't productive. He wanted to focus on moving forward, on practical solutions that would allow us to maintain a relationship without addressing the underlying issues that had damaged it. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, but we were essentially speaking different languages. Michael was negotiating for a return to the status quo with minimal adjustments. I was insisting on fundamental changes in how we treated each other. He wanted quick fixes and surface solutions. I was requiring deep work and genuine transformation. When we finally hung up, I felt the exhausting clarity that comes from recognizing an unbridgeable gap. Michael wasn't capable of the kind of self-examination that real change would require. He was too invested in seeing himself as the victim of circumstances rather than the author of choices. Too committed to maintaining his position as the center of every relationship rather than participating in genuine reciprocity. That evening, I sat down with my laptop and composed an email to Janet Morrison. I asked her to schedule a meeting to finalize the changes to my will. The conversations with Michael had confirmed what I had already suspected. He viewed me as a means to an end rather than a person worthy of respect and consideration. If that was how he chose to see me, then he could live with the consequences of that choice. The next morning brought a phone call from Jennifer, her voice carefully modulated in the tone she used when trying to manage a crisis. She said that Michael had told her about their conversation, that she was concerned about how things were developing between us. She suggested that maybe some family counseling might help, that sometimes outside perspectives could help families work through communication problems. I appreciated the suggestion, I told her, but counseling only worked when all parties were willing to examine their own contributions to relationship problems. Based on my recent conversations with Michael, he seemed more interested in having his behavior validated than in changing it. Jennifer pushed back gently, saying that Michael was trying, that he genuinely wanted to repair our relationship. She asked if I could give him more time to adjust, to learn how to express himself better. The request revealed how deeply the family had internalized the idea that my role was to absorb Michael's failures to communicate respectfully while waiting patiently for him to mature into basic decency. I told Jennifer that I had given Michael 38 years to learn how to treat his mother with respect. If he hadn't figured it out by now, I wasn't optimistic that more time would solve the problem. I wasn't interested in being anyone's relationship while they learned how to behave like a caring family member. The conversation with Jennifer was shorter than my talks with Michael, but no less revealing. She was clearly invested in maintaining family harmony, but her definition of harmony required me to continue accepting unacceptable behavior in the interest of keeping peace. She spoke about compromise and understanding, but meant only the kind that required me to give ground while Michael maintained his position. When she asked what it would take for me to forgive Michael and move past this situation, I told her that forgiveness wasn't something Michael could achieve by negotiating with her on my behalf. It would require him to understand what he was asking forgiveness for, to demonstrate genuine remorse for the pain he had caused, and to commit to changes that would prevent similar situations in the future. Jennifer's silence suggested that these requirements felt unreasonable to her, which told me everything I needed to know about how the family viewed my feelings and needs. If asking for basic respect and genuine remorse felt like too much, then we were operating from fundamentally different understandings of what relationships should involve. After that conversation, I turned off my phone and spent the rest of the day working in the greenhouse, tending to plants that responded predictably to care and attention. The basil thrived when watered properly and wilted when neglected. The rosemary grew strong when given adequate sunlight and struggled in the shade. The relationship between effort and result was clear, honest, and reliable in ways that human relationships rarely were. That evening, Margaret stopped by with a bottle of wine and the kind of intuitive timing that comes from decades of friendship. She didn't ask about my family situation directly, but she listened while I described the past few days' conversations. When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment before observing that some people spent so much energy defending their behavior that they never had any left for changing it. Her comment crystallized something I had been struggling to articulate. Michael wasn't really trying to repair our relationship. He was trying to convince me that it didn't need repairing. He wasn't working toward change. He was working toward absolution. He wanted me to accept his version of events in which he was a well-meaning son who had made a minor mistake rather than a grown man who had deliberately excluded his mother from his life. The next week passed quietly, with no calls from Michael or Jennifer. I suspected they were regrouping, perhaps consulting with other family members or friends about how to handle what they saw as my unreasonable position. I used the silence to continue preparing for the changes I was making, both to my will and to my life. Carlos and I spent several afternoons reviewing the farm's operations and discussing how the transition to foundation ownership might work. He was excited about the educational programs we were planning, about the possibility of hosting university research projects and sustainable farming workshops. His enthusiasm reminded me that not all legacies were about passing wealth to blood relatives. Some were about creating something larger than any individual family. Sophia helped me research scholarship programs for agricultural students, particularly those from farm worker families who might not otherwise have access to higher education. We drafted criteria for awards that would prioritize not just academic achievement, but also commitment to sustainable farming practices and rural community development. Margaret and I began planning a community garden project that would use part of the farm's acreage to teach local families about growing their own food. The program would be free to participants and would include not just gardening instruction, but also classes on food preservation, nutrition, and cooking with seasonal ingredients. Each of these projects represented a different way of thinking. About inheritance, about what it meant to leave something valuable behind. Instead of simply transferring wealth from one generation to the next, I was creating systems that would continue benefiting people for decades to come. Instead of enriching one person who had shown little appreciation for what he was receiving, I was supporting many people who would use their opportunities to help others. The work was energizing in a way that surprised me. For months, I had been focused on what I was losing in my relationship with Michael. Now I was discovering what I was gaining by redirecting my energy toward people and projects that aligned with my values. I was creating a legacy that reflected who I actually was rather than who someone else wanted me to be. 2 weeks after our last conversation, Michael called again. This time, his approach was different. Instead of arguing or defending, he asked if he could drive up to Montana to talk in person. He said he had been thinking about our conversations, that he wanted to understand my perspective better. The request caught me off guard. After weeks of resistance and defensiveness, Michael seemed to be offering something that looked like openness. I agreed to meet with him, but I set conditions. He would need to come alone, without Jennifer or the children. We would meet at my house, on my terms, without predetermined time limits or agendas. If he wanted to understand my perspective, he would need to listen without interrupting or arguing. Michael agreed to my conditions, and we scheduled the meeting for the following Saturday. I spent the intervening days preparing myself emotionally for a conversation that could go in any direction. Either Michael had genuinely begun to understand the seriousness of our situation, or he was trying a new strategy for getting what he wanted without changing what he was offering. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of heavy clouds that promise snow before evening. I made coffee and waited, watching the road for the rental car that would bring either reconciliation or final confirmation that our relationship had run its course. When Michael's car appeared in my driveway, I felt a mixture of hope and resignation that reminded me of waiting for medical test results. The next few hours would determine whether there was anything left to save between us, or whether we would need to find a way to coexist as strangers who happened to share a history. He knocked on the door with the hesitant politeness of someone who was no longer sure of their welcome. When I opened it, I saw something in his face that I hadn't seen in years: uncertainty. For the first time in our recent interactions, Michael looked like someone who genuinely didn't know what was going to happen next. I invited him in and offered coffee, which he accepted gratefully. We sat in my living room, the same space where he had played as a child, where we had shared countless conversations over the years. But today, the familiar setting felt strange, like a stage set for a play neither of us had rehearsed. Michael began by thanking me for agreeing to meet with him. He said he had spent a lot of time thinking about our previous conversations, that he was beginning to understand that he had been approaching our problems from the wrong angle. He wasn't here to convince me that I was wrong, he said. He was here to try to understand where he had gone wrong. The words were promising, But I had learned to listen for substance behind the rhetoric. Michael had always been good with words when he needed to be. The question was whether his understanding had actually changed, or whether he had simply found a new way to present the same old arguments. I told him that I was willing to listen, but that listening was different from agreeing. If he had genuinely begun to examine his own behavior, I wanted to hear about that examination. If he was simply looking for a more effective way to convince me to return to our previous dynamic, then this conversation would be as unsuccessful as our previous ones. Michael nodded and took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for something difficult. Then he began to speak, and for the first time in months, I heard something in his voice that sounded like my son. Michael's words came differently this time, stripped of the defensive posturing that had characterized our recent conversations. He spoke slowly, carefully, like someone navigating unfamiliar terrain without a map. He said he had been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself over the past few weeks, truths that he had been avoiding for longer than he cared to admit. He talked about the moment he had realized that blocking my number wasn't just a boundary-setting exercise, as he had convinced himself at the time. It was an act of cruelty disguised as self-care, a way of punishing me for existing in his life when existence felt inconvenient. He said he had been sitting in his Denver office, staring at his phone, when he finally understood that he had treated his mother like a telemarketer whose calls he could simply stop accepting. The admission hung between us like a bridge that might bear weight or might collapse under the pressure of years of accumulated damage. I watched his face as he spoke, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus strategic positioning. What I saw was something I hadn't witnessed from Michael in years: actual shame. He continued, describing how he had justified the blocking to himself and later to Jennifer. He had framed it as necessary for his mental health, as a way of managing stress and creating space for more important priorities. He had never stopped to consider what message this sent about my importance in his life, or how it might feel to discover that your own child found your voice so burdensome that silence was preferable. When he paused, I didn't rush to fill the space with reassurance or forgiveness. This conversation was his to lead, and I wanted to see where he would take it without prompting from me. The silence stretched until he continued, this time talking about our Christmas confrontation and how it had forced him to see our relationship from my perspective for the first time. He said that standing on my porch, being turned away from the house where he had always been welcome, had been a shock that cut through his assumptions about how families worked. He had taken my availability for granted so completely that my unavailability felt like a betrayal, even though he was the one who had withdrawn first. Michael described the drive back to Denver after that failed Christmas visit, how Jennifer had asked him to explain what had really happened between us. For the first time, he had tried to tell the story from my point of view instead of his own, and in doing so, he had begun to understand the pattern of dismissal and entitlement that had slowly poisoned our relationship. He talked about how he had treated my concerns as problems to be managed rather than feelings to be respected. How he had responded to my attempts at connection with suggestions for how I could be less needy, less demanding, less present in his life. How he had somehow convinced himself that reducing my role in his world was kindness rather than rejection. As Michael spoke, I felt something shifting inside me that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't entirely skepticism either. This version of my son was someone I recognized from earlier years, before success and family responsibilities had hardened him into someone who measured relationships by their convenience rather than their depth. But recognition wasn't the same, as trust and pretty words weren't the same as changed behavior. I had been disappointed too many times to accept apologies without evidence, and Michael seemed to understand this as he moved from confession to commitment. He said he wanted to rebuild our relationship, but he understood now that rebuilding meant starting from the ground up rather than repairing surface damage. He couldn't simply promise to call more often or visit more regularly because the problems between us weren't about frequency of contact. They were about fundamental respect and consideration. Michael proposed a different approach to our relationship, one that acknowledged my autonomy and value rather than treating me as an appendage to his life. He wanted to establish regular communication that worked for both of us, not just emergency calls when he needed something or obligatory check-ins that felt more like chores than connections. He also wanted to include me more meaningfully in his family's life, not as a service provider or occasional visitor, but as someone whose presence added value to their experiences. He spoke about bringing his children to the farm not just for holidays, but for longer visits where they could learn about the land and the work that sustained it. The proposals were encouraging, but I had learned to listen for what wasn't being said as carefully as what was. Michael was talking about changes in how we interacted, but he wasn't addressing the deeper issues of respect and consideration that had led to our crisis. I asked him directly whether he understood that our problems weren't just about communication patterns, but about his fundamental attitude toward me and my worth. Did he see me as a person with my own needs and feelings, or as a resource that existed primarily to serve his family's interests? The question seemed to catch him off guard, and I watched him struggle with an answer that would be both honest and acceptable. Finally, he admitted that he had fallen into the trap of seeing me primarily in relation to what I could provide, rather than who I was as an individual. My identity had become so wrapped up in being his mother that he had forgotten I was also Bianca, a woman with her own dreams, disappointments, and desires. This acknowledgement felt more significant than all his previous apologies combined. Michael wasn't just admitting to specific actions that had hurt me. He was recognizing a worldview that had reduced me to a function rather than celebrating me as a person. But understanding a problem and solving it were different challenges entirely. I asked Michael what concrete steps he planned to take to shift from seeing me as a role to seeing me as a person. How would he remind himself that my needs mattered as much as his convenience? How would he resist the temptation to fall back into old patterns when life became stressful again? Michael's answer revealed that he had given these questions serious thought. He wanted to establish regular conversations that focused on my life and interests, rather than just family logistics or crisis management. He wanted to learn about the farm operation, about my relationships with Carlos and Margaret, about the projects and passions that filled my days. He also wanted to involve his children in these efforts, teaching them to see their grandmother as someone with stories and skills, rather than just someone who provided presence and hospitality. He spoke about bringing them to Montana for working visits where they could participate in farm activities and learn about the land their inheritance would someday help preserve. The mention of inheritance brought us to territory we hadn't yet explored directly. Michael said he had been thinking about my comments regarding his expectations about inheriting the farm, and he wanted to address those assumptions head-on. He admitted that he had taken my legacy for granted, assuming that the farm would automatically pass to him regardless of how he treated me or whether he demonstrated any appreciation for what I had built. He had thought about inheritance as an entitlement rather than a gift, something he deserved by virtue of being my son, rather than something he needed to earn through his actions and character. Michael said he now understood that inheritance was a privilege that could be revoked, that my decision about what to do with my life's work should be based on who would best preserve and honor it, rather than who happened to be related to me. If he wanted to be part of the farm's future, he would need to prove that he understood its value and was committed to maintaining its mission. This conversation was moving into areas I hadn't expected to discuss today, but Michael's willingness to address inheritance directly suggested a level of maturity I hadn't seen from him in years. I asked him what kind of relationship he envisioned with the farm if he were to inherit it, whether he saw it as an asset to be managed from Denver, or a responsibility that would require more direct involvement. Michael's response surprised me with its thoughtfulness. He said he had been researching sustainable agriculture programs, thinking about how he might contribute to the farm's operation even while maintaining his career in finance. He spoke about spending summers in Montana with his family, about learning the business well enough to make informed decisions about its future. He also acknowledged that his urban lifestyle and financial background might not prepare him well for the daily realities of farming, and he wanted to work closely with Carlos and other experienced staff members to ensure continuity of operations. He wasn't planning to retire to Montana immediately, but he was willing to make regular extended visits that would allow him to understand the business thoroughly. These plans sounded promising, but they also raised questions about timing and sincerity. Michael was saying all the right things, but was he prepared to follow through on these commitments when they conflicted with his other priorities? Was he willing to invest the time and energy that real change would require? I told him that I appreciated his thoughtfulness, but that words alone couldn't rebuild the trust that had been damaged over months and years of disappointment. If he was serious about changing our relationship, he would need to demonstrate that seriousness through consistent actions over time. Michael nodded and said he understood that trust had to be earned rather than demanded. He asked what kinds of actions would be most meaningful to me, what changes I most wanted to see in how we related to each other. The question forced me to articulate expectations I had been feeling rather than thinking. I wanted communication that was mutual rather than one-sided, conversations where he asked about my life as often as he shared information about his. I wanted visits that felt like genuine connection rather than obligatory appearances. I wanted to be included in family decisions that affected me rather than simply informed about conclusions that had already been reached. Most importantly, I wanted to feel valued for who I was rather than what I provided. I wanted my opinions sought and respected, my boundaries acknowledged and honored, my contributions recognized and appreciated. I wanted to be treated like family rather than like staff. Michael listened without interrupting, taking notes on a small pad he had brought with him. When I finished, he read back what he had written, asking if he had captured my concerns accurately. The gesture felt respectful in a way that simple agreement might not have. He then asked about timelines and expectations. How would we measure progress in rebuilding our relationship? What would success look like, and how would we know if we were moving in the right direction? These were practical questions that showed Michael was approaching our reconciliation with the same systematic thinking he applied to business problems. The approach felt both encouraging and slightly concerning. Relationships weren't projects to be managed, but perhaps his analytical nature could serve us well if it led to consistent follow-through on his commitments. We spent the next hour discussing specific steps and schedules. Michael proposed calling Me Weekly, not with agendas or problems to solve, but simply to check in and maintain connection. He wanted to plan monthly visits to Montana, staying long enough to participate meaningfully in farm activities rather than just passing through. He also wanted to bring his children for extended summer visits, creating opportunities for them to develop real relationships with both me and the land. These wouldn't be vacation trips where I provided entertainment and services, but working visits where the children would contribute to farm operations appropriate to their ages. As our conversation continued, I felt cautiously optimistic about the possibility of rebuilding something meaningful with Michael. He seemed to understand not just what had gone wrong between us, but why it had gone wrong. More importantly, he appeared committed to doing the difficult work that real change would require. But one significant topic remained unaddressed. I hadn't told Michael about the changes I had made to my will, about the foundation I was establishing, or the redirected inheritance that would dramatically alter his financial expectations. These decisions had been made in response to his previous behavior, but they might also serve as a test of his newly expressed values. I decided that this conversation had covered enough ground for one day. Michael's words were encouraging, but I wanted to see evidence of changed behavior before making any decisions about whether to modify my estate planning. If he was genuinely committed to rebuilding our relationship, he would demonstrate that commitment regardless of financial incentives. As Michael prepared to leave, he thanked me for giving him the opportunity to apologize and explain. He said he understood that forgiveness would have to be earned rather than granted, and he was prepared to invest whatever time and effort that process required. I walked him to the door, feeling something I hadn't experienced in our relationship for months. Hope. Not certainty, not immediate trust, but hope that we might find a way forward that honored both his growth and my boundaries. After his car disappeared down the gravel road, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea and thought about the afternoon's conversation. Michael had said many of the right things, demonstrated awareness of problems I wasn't sure he had previously, understood. But pretty words were easy. Consistent action over time was much more difficult. The real test would come in the weeks and months ahead, as Michael tried to transform good intentions into lasting changes in how we related to each other. If he succeeded, we might rebuild something even stronger than what we had lost. If he failed, at least I would know that I had given our relationship every possible chance to survive. Either way, I had learned something valuable about my own worth and strength. I was no longer willing to accept crumbs of affection disguised as family obligation. I deserved better, and I was finally prepared to insist on it. That evening, Margaret called to check on how the meeting had gone. I described the conversation honestly, sharing both my cautious optimism and my remaining skepticism. She listened thoughtfully before observing that people could change when the consequences of not changing became unacceptable to them. Her comment reminded me that Michael's apparent transformation might be motivated more by what he stood to lose than by what he hoped to gain. But perhaps the motivation mattered less than the results, as long as those results included genuine respect and consideration for my feelings and needs. Time would tell whether today's conversation marked the beginning of a renewed relationship or simply a more sophisticated attempt to maintain the status quo. Either way, I was no longer the same person who had accepted dismissal and disrespect in the name of family harmony. I had found my voice, established my boundaries, and discovered the strength to enforce both. Whatever happened next with Michael, I would face it as someone who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to defend it. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen watching Michael help his 10-year-old daughter Emma collect eggs from our chickens while his younger son Tyler assisted Carlos with feeding the goats. The scene felt both familiar and entirely new, like returning to a place you had loved after years away and finding it transformed by your own changed perspective. Michael had kept his promises with a consistency that surprised even me. The weekly phone calls came every Tuesday evening, conversations that meandered through discussions of weather, farm operations, his work challenges, and my daily routines. These weren't the hurried check-ins of our past, but genuine exchanges where we each shared pieces of our lives without agenda or obligation. The monthly visits had become treasured events, not because they were elaborate or entertaining, but because they felt authentic. Michael arrived prepared to work, wearing clothes that could handle dirt and sweat. He learned to operate irrigation systems, helped with greenhouse maintenance, and even mastered the art of harvesting herbs without damaging the plants. His hands, once soft from office work, now bore the honest calluses of someone who understood physical labor. More significantly, he had begun to see the farm as I saw it, not just as a business or an asset, but as a living system that required respect, patience, and daily care. He asked thoughtful questions about sustainable practices, took notes on crop rotation schedules, and showed genuine interest in the environmental impact of our operations. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. Michael had learned to listen without immediately offering solutions, to ask about my feelings without dismissing them as inconvenient, to value my perspective without needing to control or manage it. He treated me like an expert in my own life, rather than someone who needed his guidance to navigate simple decisions. His children had blossomed during these farm visits in ways that delighted me. Emma, initially reluctant to touch anything dirty, had become fascinated with the greenhouse operations and could identify dozens of herbs by sight and smell. Tyler, who had been shy and clingy during previous visits, now roamed the property. With confidence, befriending the animals, and learning to handle farm tools appropriate to his size. Both children had developed genuine relationships with Carlos and his family, seeing them as friends and teachers rather than hired help. They played with Sophia's younger cousins, learned Spanish phrases for farm terms, and absorbed lessons about hard work and respect for the land that no amount of money could purchase. Jennifer's attitude had shifted as well, though more gradually than Michael's. She still preferred her creature comforts and would never be mistaken for a farm woman, but she no longer wrinkled her nose at the smell of compost or complained about gravel roads. She had learned to pack appropriate clothing for farm visits and even contributed to meal preparations without being asked. More importantly, Jennifer had stopped trying to manage my relationship with Michael. She no longer offered suggestions for how I might be more understanding or accommodating, no longer positioned herself as a mediator between us. She seemed to recognize that our relationship was ours to navigate, and her role was to support rather than control the process. The changes hadn't happened overnight, and there had been moments when I wondered if Michael would revert to his old patterns when stress levels rose or convenience beckoned. But each challenge had been met with renewed commitment rather than retreat. When work crises demanded his attention during scheduled calls, he rescheduled rather than simply missing them. When travel complications threatened to cancel visits, he found alternative arrangements rather than settling for postponement. The consistency of his efforts had slowly rebuilt my trust, not just in his words, but in his character. Michael had demonstrated that he could choose growth over comfort, could prioritize relationships over convenience, could value connection more than control. 3 months ago, I had made a decision that reflected this renewed trust. I called Janet Morrison and asked her to schedule another appointment to discuss my will. When we met, I explained that circumstances had changed significantly since our last conversation, that the relationship I had been trying to preserve had been successfully rebuilt on a stronger foundation. Janet listened without judgment as I described Michael's transformation and asked thoughtful questions about my confidence in its permanence. She reminded me that wills could be changed again if future circumstances warranted, that my decision now didn't lock me into any permanent course of action. After considerable discussion, I decided to restore Michael as the primary beneficiary of my estate, but with important modifications that reflected the lessons we had both learned. The new will included specific provisions requiring the farm to continue operating as a sustainable agricultural business, with educational and research components that would benefit the broader community. Michael would inherit the property, but with conditions that ensured its preservation as more than just a valuable asset. He would be required to work closely with Carlos and other experienced staff to maintain the farm's organic certifications, and to continue the scholarship programs I had established for farm workers' children. The will also included substantial provisions for Carlos and his family, recognizing their years of dedication and ensuring their security, regardless of any future changes in farm ownership. Margaret would receive the small cabin she had always admired at the edge of the property, along with enough funds to maintain it comfortably. I hadn't told Michael about these changes yet, wanting to see if his commitment to our relationship would continue without the motivation of financial inheritance. His behavior over the past 6 months suggested that it would, but I had learned the value of verification over trust when it came to matters of such importance. Today felt like the right time to share this news. Michael and his family were spending a full week at the farm, their longest visit yet, and every day had reinforced my confidence in the changes he had made. He worked alongside Carlos each morning, spent afternoons with his children, and devoted evenings to conversations with me that felt like the relationship I had always hoped we could have. As we gathered for dinner that evening, I looked around the table at faces illuminated by candlelight and genuine contentment. Emma was describing the different types of soil she had learned to identify, while Tyler demonstrated the proper way to hold a baby goat. Jennifer was asking Carlos about his daughter's plans for graduate school, and Michael was listening to Margaret's story about the hawk family that had nested near her house. This was what family felt like when built on respect rather than obligation, when nurtured by choice rather than maintained by guilt. The conversations flowed naturally, without anyone dominating or withdrawing, without undercurrents of tension or resentment. We were simply people who cared about each other, sharing a meal and our lives without condition or reservation. After the children had been tucked into bed and Jennifer and Margaret had settled in the living room with wine and photo albums, Michael and I walked out to the ridge where I had made so many important decisions over the years. The stars were brilliant in the clear mountain air, and the valley below us held the peaceful quiet that comes only to places where the land still remembers its original purpose. I told Michael about the changes I had made to my will, about the foundation that would support the farm's mission, about the provisions that would protect the people who had earned their place in our family through loyalty and hard work. I watched his face carefully as I explained the conditions attached to his inheritance, the responsibilities that would come with ownership. His response confirmed everything I had hoped for during these months of rebuilding. Michael said he was honored by my decision, but that it wouldn't change his commitment to our relationship or to the farm. He had discovered something during his time here that was more valuable than financial security, a sense of purpose and connection that had been missing from his life in Denver. He talked about his plans to transition gradually toward spending more time in Montana, about involving his family more deeply in the farm's operations, about ensuring that the next generation would understand the value of the land they might someday inherit. His words carried the weight of genuine conviction rather than strategic positioning. As we walked back toward the house, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from seeing a difficult problem solved through patience and principled action. The farm would continue to thrive under Michael's eventual ownership, not because he was my son, but because he had earned the right to inherit it through his changed character and demonstrated commitment. The blocked phone number that had started this entire crisis seemed like ancient history now, a catalyst that had forced both of us to examine what we truly valued and what we were willing to do to preserve it. Michael had learned that relationships require investment rather than assumption, that love must be demonstrated rather than simply declared. I had learned that boundaries were not barriers to relationship, but foundations for healthy connection, that demanding respect was not selfish, but necessary. Most importantly, I had discovered that my worth was not dependent on anyone else's recognition, that I could choose who deserved access to my life and my legacy. Standing on my porch that night, listening to the sounds of a house filled with people who had earned their place in my life, I understood that some inheritances can't be blocked or redirected. The most valuable things I had to give, wisdom, strength, dignity, love, had already been passed on to those who could recognize their worth. The farm would flourish under Michael's care, the foundation would support future generations of sustainable farmers, and the relationships I had built would continue to grow and strengthen. My son had unblocked more than my phone number. He had unblocked his own capacity for growth and connection. And I had learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to earn what they thought they deserved, to become worthy of what they assumed was theirs by right. In teaching Michael to value our relationship, I had discovered my own immeasurable worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.